Today I want to talk about Lightng and Unity 5. It's a fairly big subject, which means that before we get into Unity, I want to go over a couple of bits of theory just so we're clear on what Unity is trying to do. The reason for this is because Lightng is a complicated beast. It's almost one of those holy grail things of the game tech world where people want real-time dynamic lights at very efficient resource costs. So, as you might think, Lightng is very resource hungry. If you're going to physically and accurately simulate Lightng, you won't do it in real time. We're talking about working out where photons are bouncing around a scene. So game engines have to interpret Lightng using a few different systems. So to put that in context, I just want to look at a couple of images of Lightng and just go over what's going on, and then from there we can look at how Unity is essentially representing light in its engine. So this first image, it's actually a 3D image, but it shows some good concepts off well. We've got light coming in through a window, and this is what we would call direct light. It is literally light from the sun, shebang, through the window, and you can see that has caused these light patterns, which are essentially the shape of the window being overlaid onto the environment. Now, being the fact that this is a solid structure, you could argue that the rest of this place should be in darkness, right? Well, this comes to the second kind of, we just talked about direct light. Now there's a second kind of light, which is ambient light. And this is the light that has bounced all the way around. So light will come through the window, hit this wall, bounce down, bounce up, bounce around, and suddenly you get this nice diffused glow emanating from all the lit areas. And so when you open your windows, that's what the light is. It's light not just coming in directly, but it's also bouncing around. So again, there's two things there. That's direct light and then ambient light, which we're just going to say is the bounce light. And then if we go to this image here, this is actually one from the Unreal Engine, but I like it because it shows some reflections going on. Now, reflected light is another kind of light because a reflective surface will reflect an image off of it. So even if the surface itself is in darkness, it can reflect a light image back. So it's a little bit different again. On this image, we have the light coming in this way. It's coming from a big window. And you can see that we're generally more lit up in this end than we are that end. So we can see a little bit of direct light down here. And then the rest is just bounced around, and the other light source is coming down from these lights here. Now, just on this metal bit, you can see the reflection of the window actually. So it's a very bright sunny day. And that's going to illuminate slightly, but even if this table was shadowed and not illuminated, you'd still see this reflection, and that's going to essentially cause some form of light as well. So reflected light is slightly different. So here we have the reflection of the walls coming down because we've got a super shiny computer generated floor, and they tend to be overly reflective sometimes. And this guy, as you can see, we've got the reflection of the room above, and that's, even though this area isn't fantastically lit, this area is now lighter because of the reflection. So reflected light, same on these vases here, same on this sculpture over here. The reflected areas are providing some form of illumination. So, okay, just summarize. We're talking about direct light, how that light bounces off, which is ambient light, and then we're talking about reflected light. So just going to go through a couple more pictures just to emphasize that. This is a box in a room with a light source. Now, direct light is coming through this window hole here, and we can see that the box is casting a very definite shadow. The scene makes sense, but it's not really realistic. It doesn't feel realistic. This feels way too dark because we're only showing direct light. We're not showing any bounce light. Now if we add some bounce light to it, you suddenly realize that after some calculations that actually there's a ball behind this guy, and this bounce light going everywhere is illuminating the scene even more. So and everything starts to look a bit more natural as it would with this bright light source. Now we're getting some interesting things happening. There's lots to do with ambient light and its effects, but because we've got a bright red surface, the light's coming in, it's bouncing off, and it's taking some of that colour and hitting the floor. When I say taking some of that colour, it's reflecting some of that colour, and so we get this red bleed out, which is literally the light hitting a bright coloured surface and coming out, and we're even getting it over here. So the light is bouncing, bouncing, and bouncing. So we can call that colour bleeding. And just to look at the effect of reflected light, if we compare these two images, this one and this one, you'll see that they're the exact same setup, except reflective materials have been placed on the cube and the ball. So as I was saying, this ball is actually in darkness, but it's reflecting the lit image around it. So we're getting some form of illumination from it. Same for this guy. So if they weren't reflective, they'd be in darkness. So there is a form of illumination that comes from these reflections, and that's another system that's been placed into Unity. So next what we're going to do is we're going to go into Unity and just have a look at how it is simulating direct light, ambient light, and reflected light, and how they kind of all blend together. Okay, here is a basic scene in Unity. All we have is our direct light. We have a ball that is fairly reflective, and this ground plane here. Now firstly, let's talk about direct light. The direct light is coming from the directional light, which makes sense. So if I move this guy about, our shadow is going to move around because our light becomes a different focal point. So we can see the shadows being emitted. If I turn this off, in theory all our light should go because it's our light source. However, we can still see that our ball is very clear still, and our ground plane is still pretty visible. So what we need to do is just have a little look at the lighting settings to work out what's going on. So if you haven't already got a lighting tab open, go to Window and Lighting, and the menu will drop down, and you can hook it up to the top here if you like. Now, the lighting settings are the global lighting settings, and they're basically saying, do you want to pre-process lighting, what's real time, and the rest of it. Now, for the purpose of this video, I want to keep everything in real time. I'm not going to go over the ways in which we bake light maps or this kind of thing. I just want to go over how Unity is using direct light, ambient light, and reflected images to create its lighting effects. So if we look at our lighting panel, we can see we have a thing called ambient source, ambient intensity, and we also have reflection intensity. So they're on a scale of 0 to 1. At 1 they're on, at 0 they're off, and anything in between is an integer of that. So ambient intensity, if I take that down, you can see that our scene gets a little bit darker. If I take our reflection intensity down, our scene suddenly gets very dark, and we suddenly realize that the reflection intensity in Unity is actually quite strong. This reflection is actually adding an awful lot of illumination information to the scene. So if I turn that on in a different order, if I firstly turn on our directional light, I'll just go to the inspector and turn that on again, you can see we've still got our directional light. It's a lot more dulled down because it hasn't got anything else, and everything looks a lot simpler. So our ambient and reflective light was actually giving us some really nice kind of effects that made everything look a lot more natural. This on its own is a bit dull. I mean, I can do things like up the intensity, but we don't become more realistic by doing that. We just end up blanching out all the values. So this time I'll turn on the ambient intensity, and that brightened things a little bit, not intensely. I'll go into that in a minute because of how I set them up. And then if I turn up the reflection intensity, we're back here again. So these three components, your light source, your ambient intensity, and your reflection intensity, are going to cause a lot of interesting effects in your scene. So it's worth having a play with these. Right, I'll go into the ambient source at the moment and just have a look at that. So if I take the reflection intensity down, we've got the ambient source here. Now this is saying, what do you want as your ambient source, obviously. And if I click that, we have a choice of skybox, gradient, or color. If we click skybox, it is going to be this guy around us. The skybox is our background. Which I don't really want to use at the moment. Gradient and color will give you a bit more choice unless you really need the skybox. If we go just to color, we get a single color. And what you'll notice is that it will make it seem like, if I just take a really extreme color, that we have an ambient, this color is the ambient color, which is quite cool for some effects. Not very realistic, but you can suddenly see how powerful the ambient color can be. In fact, if I keep this on and turn the directional light off, you'll notice what the ambient is actually doing. If I turn it you won't see it with that. So if I turn it to a color again, the ambient is just overlaying everything with a color. Now, this is a very cheap way and a very efficient way of getting ambient color into your scene. Now, if I go for gradient, we can get an even more complicated ambient color. So at the moment, it's set to the sky color, which is being green, and we've got equator color and ground color. And think of these as top, middle, and bottom. So sky color affects all the top areas of the models. The equator color, that affects all the middle. So if I suddenly turn this to extreme color, let's go for a red, you'll see the middle of our model has gone red. And if I turn the ground area, that will change any shaded areas on the model itself, not shadowed, but any shaded areas, to that particular color. So I can turn this to, let's say, a light blue. And so we can get some really interesting effects. Now, we don't really want this if we're trying to be realistic. If I turn the light on again, it doesn't really look that great. So I'm just going to go to my lighting. I'm going to turn the top color to something a bit more natural, like a light blue, as if the sky was there. The equator color to something a little bit darker, but maybe a bit of color to it. And the ground color to darker color. So it's not quite as extreme, but it's still having a very big effect on our scene. So if I take the ambient off for a second and whack up the reflection intensity. Now at the moment, the reflection works on a thing called reflection probes. Now I'm not going to go into the fine details of those at the moment, but what it's basically doing is grabbing a snapshot of the scene and overlaying that image on everything. To give you all these images back, and depending on how reflective the material of the item is itself will determine how much is reflected back. Now if I say got rid of the skybox, it would still retain the reflective image. This is because it needs to, each time you change reflective source, build the reflection probe back to apply to the scene. So if I click build now, you'll notice that reflection intensity has suddenly gone to nothing because there's nothing to reflect. I've taken away its skybox that I was using for all its beautiful colors. So I'm just going to add this back and then click build again. And we've got our reflection back. So between these three things, our direct light, our reflection intensity, and our ambient intensity, we can create all sorts of effects. And what I'll do next is I'll just show you an example with a couple more models on how the playing about with the ambient, the reflection, and the direct light will change the look and feel of the scene quite dramatically. Okay, in this scene, we'll look at how we can use the lighting systems of Unity to create a simple thing like turning day to night. And it's a pretty simple process. It's all about thinking about what aspects of light are around in the daytime and what are around at nighttime. So here we go. We got Mr. Cow again. He's sitting on some rocks. And we've got kind of either a sunrise or a sunset kind of feel to this. The reason for that is we obviously have some form of direct light, but we have these very deep, rich yellows and oranges which come through, which only really come in sunrise and sunset. So we get the feeling of either waking up or going to sleep. As the day gets a bit lighter, the sun gets a bit whiter even. So thinking about what colours for what time of day it is a big clue to how to set up a lighting system or a lighting scene, depending on your time of day. So what if we wanted to change this to say a nighttime scene? Well, let's think about this from what do we have at night? What illuminates the place at night? It's the moon. It's the sun reflecting off the moon. Now, depending on cloud cover and the rest of it, that can be actually quite bright, but more often than not, it's going to be a faint white light that softly, because it's a reflected light as well, it's a faint white light that softly envelops the earth below it. So what do we get? We do get some shadows, we don't get them very strong. So let's look at our directional light and go, okay, what are our shadows going to do? Well, firstly, since it's more of a bluey white light, let's do that for one. Let's turn the colour to blue. Now that we've done that, it's maybe slightly whiter or maybe slightly bluer. And let's take its intensity down. We want some shadows, so we do want some contrast, but at the same time, it's not a very bright light, or it's not supposed to be that bright. So we'll start with that for the moment. And now we think to ourselves, well, what is our ambient light? Well, our ambient light is going to be the light blue again. So as soon as we change the ambient light to light blue, we get this moonlit effect. We can take that even further. We can bring some blues into our mid-tone, but we might like the contrast. The contrast might add a bit more to it, but we do get a bit more of a midnight feel as soon as we start adding more blues in. And then our ground colour, we could do some whatever we want to that. But yeah, let's add a bit more blue. And we'll just go back to our directional light and we'll just say, can we get rid of a bit more? Just a little bit. So we have some very faint shadows going on, but we get this nice scene. It's also dynamic as well. So that was just by subtly operating the directional light and the ambient light, we're able to create a totally different feel to the scene. Now, all these things you can hook into, you can control dynamically through code, colors, values, even the lighting system. So these are all at your disposal to create some really cool night and day effects. Yeah, the reflected light, if we go to that, at the moment these are rocks. The cow's got a bit of reflection, so if we take away some of the reflected light, we're not going to see too much of an effect. But that's not too much of an issue at night. In fact, the reflection intensity is only going to really affect anything that should be reflective, say a sword and a shield. If this was a moonlit scene on a sword and a shield, you'll find all the metallic bits will reflect the world more, and that's cool, and that's what it's used for. So yeah, that was a quick overview of how to quickly use the systems in Unity, the lighting systems, to develop and create a lit scene. So just to recap, when you're working with light in Unity, you think of light in its component parts. Think of what's casting the shadows, the main shadows, and use your directional light for that. And then think, okay, so what kind of general lighting comes from that, and the ambient light, and use the ambient settings for that. And then work with your reflection depending on how that highlights aspects in your scene. And with those 3 simple steps, you can create most lighting situations. And then once that is done, you then need to work on all the other little lights in your scene, like torches or anything else that will expel some form of light. And you keep adding, but only when you need to. Don't add too quickly, or you'll end up with 4 million lights and too much to organize. So yeah, enjoy your lighting.